Hey everyone, it's Darren. Welcome. Today we're doing our first video on applied mathematics, applying statistics to actual real world issues and coming up with a real world answer. If you watch the news anytime with US news, you've seen claims of voter fraud and election fraud and everything been going on. Got really ugly in 2020 and hasn't really died down since. Uh, so I'm not going to answer every question about it, and I'm not going to give opinions. What we are going to do is we're going to look at some actual numbers, though. We're going to look specifically today at dead voters and whether dead voters could have made a difference. And before we look at today, let's look at yesterday. Mayor Richard Daley is mayor of Chicago from 1955 to 1976. He was a Democratic mayor in Chicago. And Chicago and Chicago area was pretty well known in that area for having really both parties conducting a lot of election fraud, widespread, large scale fraud. There were bombings, there were fires, there were threats and intimidation and everything going on there. Uh, so if you think that this is new, it's not. This has happened before. Uh, and in recent history, Chicago was really during the uh, Richard Daley era. Chicago was really the poster child of election fraud. And they did actually make use of, among other things, dead voters. They had people who would go out to cemeteries and they would go out on a piece of paper, write down all the names, and come back, and then they would pay people to go vote with those names. And they'd get away with it, usually. Uh, it wasn't hard to do back then. Uh, if you think about what the election rolls looked like, it was just a list of names. They weren't computerized. Stuff wasn't automated. Once you registered to vote, you could stay registered to vote pretty much forever until you told them, "Hey, stop it." Uh, so, did dead voters make a difference back then? Can't say for sure. Don't know exactly how many happened. But what we do know is there's a lot of election fraud, and historians now think that the fraud in total back then probably did make a difference. So let's look at today. And again, today we're going to narrow things down to just the dead voters. We're not going to look at anything else in this video, just the dead voters, and find out how much of a difference they could have made. Uh, so first, we have to look at what changes happened since Chicago in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. One of the changes is that the voter registration system, the list of valid voters are stored on state computer systems. It's not just a big paper file anymore. When a voter dies, they get taken off that system pretty quickly. Uh, so with the old paper systems, you'd stay on there forever, pretty much. With the new computer systems, pretty much as soon as the state finds out you're dead, you're off the system. If a voter dies in a hospital, they could be taken off that system literally within hours. The hospital records the death. It goes to the state. It goes to the federal Social Security system, uh, which maintains a master list of deceased people. The Social Security system. That system is shared out to states and insurance companies and everything as well. Uh, so once you go into the computer anywhere, it spreads everywhere and it spreads fast. These are computers. They don't take weeks, months, or years anymore. You're talking minutes, hours, maybe days, probably more like hours. Uh, let's say you die outside of a hospital, and that happens all the time, of course. A death certificate's still filled out. As soon as that death certificate is put into the computer, it goes into the state and you start coming off the system again really quick. If you die somewhere remote, if you die someplace where the death certificate's filled out and it's physically mailed in. It's not entered into a computer. That's going to take longer. That might add a week or two to the process. But again, as soon as it goes into the computer, it sort of goes through everywhere. Okay. So, how do dead voters cast votes on election day? Uh, Remember when we talked about Chicago during Richard Daley? They would actually just get names off tombstones. Then they would hand the name to somebody and say, "Here, you are John Smith today. Go out and vote for him in this district, and make sure you vote for my candidate." Uh, well, it's always illegal. Uh, if you're dead coming into election day, you can't legally vote. If you vote in person on election day, walk out and get hit by a car, okay, you were still alive on election day. Uh, so all dead voters casting their votes on election day are illegal. Uh, in order to actually be able to get away with it, the voter has to have died but still be on the voter rolls as a valid voter. There's, of course, a delay between the death and the time it gets reported to the state. That's longer in some areas, shorter in others. There's a delay between reporting it to the state and the state taking you off the voter rolls. There's even more delay if, and some states, in fact, locally here in Michigan, they use printed voter rolls when you went to vote in person until a few years back. So if that gets printed up 2 weeks in advance, say, the list of all the valid voters, uh, and they're going through the printout version, all you had to do is still be a valid voter when that printed version came out. That could be a couple of weeks. So you put all this together, and you could be looking at a couple of weeks, if you're on printed rolls, plus maybe a week of other delays tops. If they're actually using computers that are connected real time as opposed to a downloaded file, potentially it might be accurate to the day. So there's not a lot of time there. Is it enough time to matter? Well, what about early voting? Early voting is something that is somewhat controversial. Uh, it varies state by state. The laws are different. With early voting, for those who aren't familiar with it, uh, you follow the same rules as you'd follow for in-person voting on election day. You physically go to a polling place. It may or may not be the same polling place you go to on election day, but you physically go to a polling place. Any ID checks are still performed. The check against the voter rolls still performed. You get the same ballot you get on election day. You fill it out the same way. You stick it into the same machine that you use on election day. So not every state allows it, but a lot of states do, and more states are starting to allow it. Uh, Dead voters for early voting are not always illegal. If you vote as a valid voter, say a week early, and then you die before election day, you voted legally. Um, your vote may or may not count, depending on the state, but you did not break any laws to do that. So early voting, depending on the state, is legal for as much as 4 weeks in advance of election day. That means that there are a lot of legal dead voters. If you voted early and then died before election day, your vote was legal, may or may not count. It opens up a little bit of a window for dead voters. If a voter dies and somehow that data gets intercepted, you could sneak somebody in to vote early really, really quick, and before it gets to the state system. Might work. Again, you don't have a lot of time, and with systems being updated, potentially within hours, certainly within days for the most part. Is there enough time there to make a difference? We'll come to that. What about absentee and mail-in voting by dead voters? As controversial as early voting was. When COVID hit in 2020, a lot of states massively increased their eligibility for absentee voting. Um, just to be very clear, absentee voting and mail in voting are exactly the same thing. Anyone who tells you different is uh, kind of not exactly telling you the truth here. Uh, the rules for absentee voting vary by state, but it has been around a while. In fact, the first absentee voting in the U.S. was done during the Civil War. Both the North and the South used absentee voting for soldiers, and it was limited to just the soldiers at that point, so that they could cast their ballots in the elections. Uh, After that, states began to roll out absentee voting for the civilian population. And that happened in some states also, still in the late 1800s. So yeah, that means absentee voting's been around for 150 years in the U.S. So it's certainly nothing new. It was done as a mail-in process then. It's done as a mail-in process today. You can mail it in or drop it off. Originally, to qualify for an absentee ballot, you had to actually be physically unable to go to the poll on election day. This usually meant either you had a documented situation where you would be out of town, like you could pull out airline tickets and show them tickets that said, "See, I'm going to be in Florida that day," or you could, if you were older than a certain age, or if you had medical documentation that you couldn't go to the poll and stand in line for the election, you were eligible for an absentee ballot. Uh, Gradually, those conditions change, and again, this is controlled state by state. Um, right now, there are a few states that do almost all voting uh, by mail. Everyone gets an absentee ballot, every registered voter, and you return your ballot by mail or drop it off at drop boxes, and that's how they conduct their election. Uh, of the states that don't do it globally, about half the states at this point, as of 2023, about half the states do no excuse absentee ballots, which means anybody that wants to can request and receive an absentee ballot. Any legal voter can request and receive absentee ballots instead of going in on election day. The remaining states do allow absentee voting, but only under certain conditions. So again, generally it's for whatever reason you're not physically going to be able to show up in person to vote, or you're not going to be able to stand there in line to vote, or whatever it is. So what are the risks with absentee voting? Well, you get all the same risks you get with early voting or in-person voting. Plus, you have the potential for mail fraud. Someone could steal the ballots. And take those ballots and fill them out and return them. Uh, a safety feature there is if I'm sent an absentee ballot, it has a number on it. If that gets stolen out of my mailbox, then I go request a new absentee ballot because I didn't receive it. They will invalidate the old ballot. If I show up in person to vote, they'll invalidate the old ballot. So if somebody sends that ballot in after it's been invalidated, it just won't count. So not as much risk there as some people think. Generally, that stuff kind of gets caught, um, and in fact, it gets caught often enough that the last half dozen elections or so, anyway, there have been stories of people who were convicted of it. Usually, what happens is not so much wholesale harvesting of the ballots from mailboxes. It's usually a voter dies and the person who maybe somebody who lived with them receives the absentee ballot after they died, or it was already there but they hadn't filled it out yet, and that person then fills out the ballot and returns it, and usually with a forged signature on it, and they get caught. And the reason they get caught is basically for the reasons we discussed. Yeah, the person dies, they're put on the list of they're taken off the list of valid voters, and an absentee ballot comes back, and the ballot's dated 4 days after the person died, and it's like, there's a problem here, and they turn it over to for investigation, and it's a pretty easy conviction at that point, really. Uh, if the person was living with somebody else, yeah, that's where they start. Uh, so it does happen, certainly. But it doesn't happen that often, and it gets caught. So how often does it not get caught? We'll figure that out. So who are the dead voters? Well, historically, as I mentioned, you did have politicians paying people to go around, write names down on tombstones, and then pay people to go vote. Doesn't happen that way so much anymore because by the time there's a tombstone, they're off the voter rolls. You have legal dead voters today. The legal dead voters today are the people who went in and voted legally. They voted early and then they died before election day, or they voted absentee and sent it in, and they must have mailed it themselves to be legal, and then they died before election day. In both cases, it depends state by state whether the ballot actually counts or not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So what about the modern illegal dead voters? Well, the documented cases we have, and the only documented cases that I've been able to find, are people like the one I mentioned, where a voter dies and somebody else gets a hold of the absentee ballot that was sent to them, fills it out, and sends it back in. Those are certainly illegal dead voters. There are claims of busloads of people being sent out. We'll do another video on the busloads theory another day. Uh, but just from the timing, you realize that there's just not a whole lot of time in there between the death and election day. You don't have a whole lot of people who are dead who are voting, who are requesting absentee ballots. In some states, you can run into a situation where a person will have two or more homes, and if they're in different states, they might get ballots in both of the states and potentially cast ballots in both states. That's illegal. It is hard to catch. There are multi-state groups that have pulled together to try to catch that so that you can only have a valid voter registration in a single state. It does still happen. This does not generally happen for people without much money. It happens for people who have multiple homes. So, how many of them are there? And does that matter? Well, we're going to find out. We're going to actually put some numbers to these things and see, given the constraints, given that you don't really have much time, you know, is it even conceivable? So we'll bring up Excel here in a second and take a look. Before I do that, though, I would like to say if you're learning anything from the video, if you are enjoying this, if you want to see more of this, uh, please hit the like button and subscribe and hit notify. That's how YouTube finds out that this video is worth watching, that my channel is worth watching. It's how I stay motivated to keep making these videos. Uh, I don't get paid for you to watch it, obviously. If we get enough subscribers, YouTube will start giving me, a penny here and a penny there. Uh, but those likes and the subscribes, that really is what keeps YouTube creators motivated to keep going. If you can, I do have a Patreon page over at patreon.com/data analysis excellence. If you go over there and help out a little bit there too, that would be great. It's not, if you can't afford it, that's great. Just please do hit the like and subscribe. Okay, so let's go over to Excel and take a look and see if we can actually figure out, is there any chance that this made a difference? Okay, so here we have 2020 population numbers. And conveniently, we're going to look at the 2020 election since that was the most contentious for voter fraud recently. And it was a census year. So we have very accurate numbers for 2020. Now, what you see over here is we have the state, the population of the state, the number of births, the number of deaths. Uh, for the year in that state. Uh, the population is at the date of the census, which was earlier in the year, uh, but really we're not looking at a huge difference here. So, a couple of things we need to figure out is how many people died, what percentage of people died, and per year and per day. And I guess I should go back a step here for people not familiar with voting in the US. We have a bizarre system of casting ballots for president here in the US. It's called the Electoral College, and maybe I'll do a video on this again some other day. Uh, the Electoral College means that each state adds up the total votes for that state only, and each state is allocated a number of electoral college votes, which equals their number of senators, which is always two per state, regardless of size, plus the number of US representatives, which can be almost anything. It increases with population. So it's not general election. You know, if we go back to 2016, for example, Trump won the electoral college vote and uh, lost the popular vote. That's happened really with increasing frequency lately, which is increasing the calls to get rid of the electoral college. Uh, but that's the situation we have, so that's what we'll use. So we're going to look state by state here instead of just looking at the national numbers. So here we have population, births, and deaths. If I care about the number of people who died in a year, that's going to be uh, equals deaths, which is D2, divided by population, which is B2. And that tells me that in Alabama, 1.29% of the population died in 2020. Okay, well, how many died per day? Well, that's going to be F2 divided by 365. So I had 0.003532% of the population died on average per day. Let's copy this down for all the states. There we go. Okay. And you see the deaths did vary quite a bit. We had, what some of them are a little over one, a lot of them are around 1%. Oh, 0.66%. Utah actually had a fairly low percentage died. And South Carolina pretty high, and Ohio pretty high. So I'm going to copy this column here because now I have the 2020 state vote count. And in this, I have by state, I have Biden vote, Trump vote, other vote, total Biden and Trump, and the percent margin. So let's copy in this right here. So in order to have changed a state, you need to have enough votes to have changed that margin. So I need to, yeah, if I want to hit 25.8% by going 0.07% at a time, it's going to take quite a few days. Well, how many days do I need? Let's find out. And that's just going to be F2 divided by G2. Is that right? Nope. Okay. Here's an example of why you can't just copy formulas over, because I just copied the wrong thing over. So copy this, come over here, and I just pasted it in, and it pasted the formula, of course. What I obviously needed to do was paste special values. That works better. Okay, so if I look at this, in Alabama, to change 25.82%, I need 7,310 days of deaths, about 2 years. Um, Not getting 2 years. Realistically, it's half that because if votes from one go to the other, and that would be absolute best case scenario for making the change. That's assuming that everyone who died, every single person in the state who died, had voted for the candidate who won, and you change it to the candidate who lost in order to change the effect, to change the result. So that one's really high. So Arizona, I only need 108, so it's 54 days. Let's just divide these by two to make life easy. Okay, so Arizona, I need 54 days. Uh, Georgia, I need 45 days. Okay, and these are the number of days between the time that voters die and the time they're taken off the rolls so that they can't actually vote. So that means Arizona, which was one of the contested states, it was almost 2 months. Georgia, month and a half. Wisconsin, more than 3 months. Pennsylvania, 6 months. Michigan, more than a year. So when you look at the data, um, you've got a few days between death and the time that the person's taken off the rolls. Worst case, absolute worst case scenario, with early voting a month out and with printed election rolls printed before the early voting started, with absentee voting, with 100% absentee or early voting, and with every single person who died having been fraudulently changed from the candidate who actually won to the losing candidate to flip the vote. Um, some of these states are years. Some of these states are, if you look at some place like, Massachusetts, that's close to 20 years there. Um, but even the closest state, which I think is Georgia at 45 days, uh, that's still a month and a half. And you don't have a month and a half. And it's not going to be 100% because some of those voters who died would have voted for the person who lost anyway. So it's not possible. We can definitively say it is not possible that dead voters changed the results of the 2020 election. The math just proves that it's impossible. So this doesn't touch on any of the other claims. It doesn't touch on uh, whether machines were tampered with. It doesn't touch on any of this other stuff. And this is one of the key things when you are using math to prove something is you have to state your limitations. This is proof specifically that dead voters did not change the election. There was not voter fraud for dead voters that way. So I'll probably do a few more videos on the elections and mathematically showing this was possible or not possible. Uh, so if you have any thoughts on that, if you have ideas for things that you'd like me to put in videos, please leave them down in the comments. Again, if you learned anything from the video, if you enjoyed it, if you want to see more, definitely hit the like button, hit subscribe, hit notify so you can see when new videos come out. If you're able to, help me out over on Patreon. It's patreon.com/data analysis excellence. I'm working on getting it set up so I can do early video releases for Patreon supporters only. It's not quite there yet. It might be by the time this video comes out. Uh, so hope you had a great day. Hope you enjoyed this video and look forward to seeing you again. And have a great day.